How did a handful of fishermen end up creating one of the most influential institutions in human history? It sounds almost impossible. Fishermen do not build nations. They do not crown emperors. They do not shape the destiny of continents. And they certainly do not lay the foundations for the smallest sovereign state on earth. Yet if you trace the story carefully, every road eventually leads back to a few ordinary men standing beside a quiet lake in Roman Judea, making a living with weathered hands, rough nets, and boats that looked no different from hundreds of others scattered along the shoreline. The question is not whether it happened. The question is how. Before you settle in for tonight's story, if you're enjoying what we do here, a like or a subscribe helps more than you'd think, but only if it's genuine. And if you've got a moment, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's always the best part of reading through the comments. Now, turn the lights down low, get comfortable, and let's begin. For just a moment, forget everything you know about the Vatican. Forget the towering dome of St. Peter's Basilica rising above the Roman skyline. Forget the marble colonnades embracing thousands of pilgrims in St. Peter's Square. Forget the Swiss guards standing watch in their colorful uniforms. None of it exists yet. There is no Vatican City. There is no Pope in the sense we understand today. There are no cardinals, no grand churches, no vast collections of priceless art. There is only a remote province of the Roman Empire, where life is measured not by politics or monuments, but by the changing winds over a freshwater lake. Imagine arriving there just before sunrise. The air is cool enough to make you pull your cloak a little tighter around your shoulders. Small wooden boats drift quietly near the shore, their owners preparing for another day's work. Nets are inspected by practiced hands. Ropes are coiled with movements repeated thousands of times before. Somewhere nearby, someone is already mending yesterday's tears in the linen mesh. Nothing about the scene suggests that history is about to change. And that is precisely why it matters. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. The moments we later describe as world-changing almost never feel extraordinary to the people living through them. They simply wake up, go to work, worry about tomorrow, and hope for a better future. That morning would have felt exactly like that. Among those fishermen was a man named Simon. History would remember him by another name, Peter, but no one called him that yet. At this point, he was simply Simon. A fisherman. A husband. A working man trying to earn enough to feed those who depended on him. Fishing on the Sea of Galilee was demanding work. Despite its name, it was not a sea at all, but a large freshwater lake surrounded by rolling hills and small villages. Its waters could appear calm for hours before sudden winds swept down from the surrounding heights, turning gentle waves into dangerous storms within minutes. Those who earned their living there understood the lake as well as they understood their own hands. They knew where the fish gathered during different seasons. They knew how the moon affected the night's catch. They knew which winds promised a productive morning and which warned them to stay close to shore. It was knowledge passed from one generation to the next, learned not from books but through years of observation and countless hours on the water. Even with experience, life remained uncertain. Some days the nets came back heavy. Others they returned almost empty. Taxes added another burden. The Roman Empire demanded its share. Local rulers demanded theirs as well. Fishing rights were often controlled or leased, meaning that even before a single fish reached the market, part of the day's work already belonged to someone else. It was an ordinary life. Hard. Predictable. Entirely forgettable. Or so it seemed. If someone had walked through those villages asking which fisherman would still be remembered 2,000 years later, Simon would have been an unlikely choice. He was not wealthy. He held no political office. He commanded no army. He wrote no famous books. By every ordinary measure, he was invisible. Yet history has a curious habit of beginning with people exactly like him. Not because they seek greatness, but because, at a certain moment, they make a decision whose consequences reach far beyond anything they could possibly imagine. For Simon, that moment began not with an empire, not with a king, not with a battle. It began with a rumor. People had started talking about a man traveling through Galilee. Some called him a teacher. Others believed he was a prophet. Stories spread from village to village with surprising speed. Travelers carried them to marketplaces. Merchants repeated them along dusty roads. Families discussed them over evening meals after the day's work had ended. Some stories sounded impossible. The sick recovering. Crowds gathering. words that lingered in people's minds long after they had returned home. As with every rumor, no one could be entirely certain what was true. But curiosity has always traveled faster than certainty. Soon enough, Simon heard those stories too. At first, perhaps they sounded no different from countless others. Galilee had seen wandering teachers before. Charismatic preachers appeared from time to time, gathering followers before fading into obscurity. Most disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. There was little reason to believe this man would be any different. And yet, something compelled Simon to stop, to listen, to pay attention. Without realizing it, he had just taken the first step in a chain of events that, nearly 2,000 years later, would eventually lead to the Vatican. History usually begins with ordinary people. That is one of the easiest truths to forget. When we look back across 2,000 years, we instinctively focus on emperors, kings, generals, and magnificent cities. We imagine history unfolding inside marble palaces or on famous battlefields. But history rarely starts there. More often, it begins with someone whose name means nothing to the rest of the world. Someone whose greatest concern is tomorrow's meal. Someone who has no ambition to change civilization. Simon was one of those people. The stories preserved in the Gospels describe his first meeting with Jesus in different ways. Each account emphasizes different details, and historians have long recognized that these traditions were shaped for different audiences and purposes. Yet they all point toward the same remarkable conclusion. At some point, Simon chose to leave behind the life he had always known. Whether the decision came in a single unforgettable moment or unfolded over a longer period, it represented an extraordinary break with everything that had defined him until then. Imagine how difficult such a choice would have been. A fishing boat was not simply a tool. It was security. It was income. It represented years of work and the ability to provide for a family. Walking away from it meant stepping into complete uncertainty. There were no guarantees, no promises of success, no clear destination. Only the decision to follow someone whose future was every bit as uncertain as his own. It is tempting, knowing how the story ends, to imagine that Simon somehow understood the importance of that moment. He did not. No one did. No one standing on the shores of Galilee believed they were witnessing the beginning of an institution that would one day influence kings and shape the history of Europe. There was no blueprint. No master plan. Only a small group of people choosing to walk together. 4 months, and then years, they traveled through towns and villages across Galilee and Judea. They slept wherever they could. They shared simple meals. They spoke with fishermen, farmers, merchants, tax collectors, widows, craftsmen, and travelers. The movement remained remarkably small. From the perspective of the Roman authorities, it barely existed. The empire governed tens of millions of people spread across 3 continents. One wandering Jewish teacher accompanied by a handful of followers was hardly the kind of phenomenon that demanded attention. Rome had seen countless religious movements come and go. Most disappeared within a generation. There was every reason to believe this one would do exactly the same. And then everything changed. Jesus was arrested. His trial was swift. His execution was public. Crucifixion was designed not only to kill, but to send a message. It reminded everyone watching exactly who possessed power. For Rome, it was intended to be the end of the story. Historically speaking, that expectation made perfect sense. Movements centered on a single charismatic leader almost always collapsed after that leader's death. Followers returned home. Communities dissolved. Names faded from memory. History moved on. By every ordinary measure, this movement should have ended on a hill outside Jerusalem. Instead, it survived. That simple fact is one of the great historical puzzles of the ancient world. The earliest Christian writings explain it through the disciples' conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them after the crucifixion. That belief became the foundation of everything they would later proclaim. Whether one approaches those accounts as an act of faith or as historical testimony, one undeniable fact remains. Within a remarkably short time, the same followers who had scattered in fear after Jesus' arrest were publicly proclaiming his message once again. Something had transformed them. Historians continue to debate many aspects of that transformation. What they do not debate is its impact. The movement did not disappear. It grew. And that single fact changed everything. Because ideas can only survive if someone chooses to carry them forward. Simon, and the others, made that choice. Without realizing it, they had just taken the second great step in the long chain that would, centuries later, lead us toward the Vatican. Paul's decision transformed Christianity from a local movement into something much larger. Until then, most believers still lived within or near the lands where Jesus had taught. The faith remained closely tied to Judea and Galilee, both geographically and culturally. Paul imagined a different future. A future in which someone born in Corinth could belong to the same community as someone living in Jerusalem. A future in which a merchant from Ephesus and a widow in Philippi could think of themselves as part of the same family of faith, despite never meeting one another. That idea was revolutionary. Not because the Roman Empire lacked diversity. It was already one of the most multicultural societies the world had ever seen. What made Christianity different was that it invited people from every background into a single community without requiring them to belong to the same nation. For the first time, a movement born in one corner of Judea began crossing languages, cultures, and borders with remarkable speed. Paul became one of its greatest travelers. Imagine setting out with him. The journey begins on foot along dusty Roman roads before continuing aboard merchant ships crossing the eastern Mediterranean. Days at sea are often calm, but storms can appear without warning. Ports bustle with sailors shouting in different languages. Warehouses overflow with grain, olive oil, wine, and textiles arriving from every corner of the empire. Every city feels different. Corinth is noisy and prosperous, filled with traders, philosophers, athletes, and travelers passing between east and west. Ephesus rises proudly along the coast of Asia Minor, famous for its magnificent harbor and the Temple of Artemis, one of the greatest architectural wonders of the ancient world. Philippi is quieter, shaped by its Roman veterans and military traditions. Rome itself is almost impossible to comprehend. Nearly 1 million people crowd its streets. Markets overflow with goods from Britain, Egypt, Spain, North Africa, and the Near East. Languages mingle together. Religions stand side by side. The city seems to contain the entire world. Wherever Paul traveled, his approach remained remarkably consistent. He did not arrive with wealth. He did not command soldiers. He did not force anyone to listen. Instead, he worked. According to his own letters, he supported himself through manual labor, likely as a tent maker or leather worker. During the day he earned his living alongside ordinary craftsmen. In the evenings he spoke with anyone willing to listen. Some rejected his message immediately. Others became curious. A few decided to join him. Those few became a community. When that community could continue on its own, Paul moved on to another city. Then another still. At first glance, the strategy seemed almost insignificant. A handful of believers here. A dozen there. Perhaps a few families gathering quietly in someone's home. Nothing about it suggested the birth of a global religion. But history often hides inside numbers too small to notice. The real genius of Paul's work was not simply founding communities. It was keeping them connected. Distance posed an enormous challenge in the ancient world. Travel was slow. News moved at the speed of ships and footsteps. Misunderstandings spread easily. Communities separated by hundreds of miles could quickly begin drifting in different directions. Paul found a solution. He wrote letters. Today we call them the epistles. To the people receiving them, they were far more than correspondence. They were guidance, encouragement, correction, a reminder that they belonged to something larger than their own city. Imagine one of those letters arriving after weeks of travel. A messenger enters a house where the local believers have gathered. The room falls silent. The scroll is carefully unrolled. Someone begins to read aloud. Paul greets friends by name. He answers questions. He encourages those who are discouraged. He settles disagreements. He reminds them of the hope that first brought them together. For many listening that evening, it would feel as though a trusted friend had walked through the door. Those letters became invisible threads stretching across the Roman Empire. They connected Corinth to Ephesus, Philippi to Thessalonica, and to Rome. One community strengthened another. One city's struggles became everyone's concern. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Christianity stopped being a collection of isolated groups. It became a network. And networks are extraordinarily difficult to destroy. That truth would soon be tested. Because as these quiet communities continued spreading across the empire, They were beginning to attract the attention of the one power that had ignored them for far too long. Rome. Rome had spent centuries learning how to deal with threats. It knew how to crush rebellions. It knew how to defeat rival kingdoms. It knew how to absorb foreign cultures without losing its own identity. The empire's strength rested on disciplined armies, efficient administration, and the quiet confidence that no challenge could endure forever. At first, Christians hardly registered as one. They were too few, too scattered, too ordinary. They possessed no armies, no fortresses, no political ambitions. From the perspective of a Roman governor, they looked like just another small religious community among hundreds that already existed across the empire. Most officials paid them little attention. But something was changing. Not because Christians suddenly became powerful. They did not. They remained poor in many places. Most belonged to the lower ranks of society: craftsmen, merchants, laborers, servants, widows, and freed slaves. What changed was their visibility. The communities Paul and others had helped establish continued growing. A traveler arriving in Anch might discover believers meeting in a private home. A merchant sailing to Corinth could find another gathering there. Someone journeying to Ephesus, Philippi, or even Rome itself would encounter familiar faces sharing the same prayers, the same stories, and the same sense of belonging. That was something entirely new. Rome understood nations. It understood cities. It understood ethnic groups and local traditions. What it struggled to understand was a community that crossed every one of those boundaries. A Roman citizen and a former slave could sit at the same table. A wealthy merchant and a fisherman could pray together. A Jew and a Gentile could consider themselves members of the same spiritual family. To modern ears, that may sound perfectly ordinary. To the ancient world, it was astonishing. The Christian movement was quietly creating relationships that ignored many of the social divisions Roman society took for granted. The empire did not immediately see this as dangerous. In fact, Rome was often remarkably tolerant when it came to religion. Across its vast territories, people worshipped countless gods. Egyptians honored Isis. Greeks worshipped Zeus and Athena. Gauls preserved their own traditions. Local temples stood beside Roman ones in cities throughout the empire. Rome generally asked only one thing in return: loyalty. Religion, for the Romans, was not merely a private matter of belief. It was woven into public life. Religious ceremonies honored the gods believed to protect the empire. Sacrifices were offered for the well-being of the emperor. Participating in these rituals was often understood as an expression of civic responsibility as much as religious devotion. Here, Christians encountered a profound dilemma. Many refused to take part in ceremonies honoring the emperor or the traditional Roman gods. Not because they wished to rebel politically. The earliest Christian writings repeatedly encouraged believers to respect governing authorities and pray for rulers. But they believed worship belonged to God alone. That distinction, clear to Christians, was far less obvious to Roman officials. Refusing public religious ceremonies could easily appear as an act of disloyalty. Suspicion slowly began to grow. Rumors spread. Some accused Christians of secret meetings whose purpose outsiders did not understand. Others misunderstood their language about sharing the body and blood of Christ during communal meals, giving rise to wild and false accusations. Fear often flourishes where knowledge is absent. Most Romans had never attended a Christian gathering. They only heard stories. And stories become distorted remarkably quickly. Still, the movement might have continued attracting only occasional attention, had history not intervened. In the summer of AD 64, disaster struck Rome. A massive fire swept across the city. 4 days, flames consumed homes, shops, temples, and entire neighborhoods. Thick smoke darkened the sky as frightened families fled through crowded streets carrying whatever possessions they could save. When the fire finally died, much of the capital lay in ruins. Thousands had lost everything. People demanded answers. Ancient sources differ about the exact causes of the catastrophe, and historians continue to debate Emperor Nero's role in the events surrounding the fire. What appears well supported, however, is that Nero blamed at least part of the disaster on the Christian community. Almost overnight, a small and largely misunderstood religious movement became the target of imperial punishment. The consequences were devastating. Some believers were arrested. Others were executed in ways designed to terrify anyone who witnessed them. The persecutions described by later Christian writers left a lasting mark on the memory of the Church. Yet here the story takes another unexpected turn. Rome intended to erase the movement. Instead, it gave it some of its first heroes. Because every community remembers those who suffer for it. And every story that survives has the power to inspire the next generation. Without realizing it, the empire had begun strengthening the very identity it hoped to destroy. The persecutions had one clear purpose: to make the movement disappear. From the empire's point of view, the logic was simple. If fear became strong enough, believers would abandon their faith, stop gathering together, and eventually dissolve back into the vast population of the Roman world. It was a strategy that had worked before. Rome had broken rebellions. It had crushed political rivals. It had erased movements that challenged its authority. There was every reason to believe Christianity would meet the same fate. Instead, something unexpected happened. The more pressure these communities faced, the stronger their sense of identity became. This does not mean the early Christians sought suffering. They did not. No one wanted to be arrested. No one hoped to face execution. The men and women who gathered in those small house churches prayed for peace just as anyone else would have. But when some among them refused to deny their faith, even under the threat of death, their stories spread far beyond the cities where they had lived. Those stories traveled remarkably well. A believer executed in Rome might be remembered weeks later by a small congregation meeting quietly in Antioch. Someone imprisoned in Smyrna could become known to Christians in Alexandria. The Roman roads carried merchants and soldiers. They also carried memory. News moved from city to city through letters, travelers, visiting merchants, and ordinary conversations. Each story strengthened another community. Each act of courage reminded distant believers that they were not alone. Over time, these men and women came to be known as martyrs. The word comes from the Greek martis, meaning witness. Originally, it did not refer simply to someone who died. It described someone whose life, and sometimes death, bore witness to what they believed. That distinction matters. The early Christians did not celebrate death itself. They honored faithfulness. Rome believed it was eliminating individuals. Instead, it was creating examples that future generations would remember. Every attempt to silence the movement seemed to give it another story worth telling. History is full of unexpected ironies. This is surely one of them. The empire possessed armies capable of conquering kingdoms. Yet it struggled against something much harder to defeat: a shared memory. Communities can survive the loss of buildings. They can survive the loss of leaders. Sometimes they can even survive persecution. What they cannot survive is forgetting who they are. The Christians refused to forget. While Rome measured strength in soldiers and fortifications, these small communities measured it differently. They measured it in faithfulness, in mutual care, in the willingness to support one another when everything else seemed uncertain. Another quiet transformation was taking place at the same time. As the years passed, these communities became increasingly organized. Someone needed to teach. Someone needed to care for the poor. Someone needed to oversee worship and maintain unity. Leadership developed naturally, not as a grand political structure, but as a practical necessity. Different cities used different terms, but one role gradually became especially important: the bishop. Each major Christian community looked to its bishop for guidance. He was not a prince. He commanded no army. His authority rested almost entirely on trust. He preserved the teachings that had been handed down. He settled disagreements when possible. He cared for widows, orphans, and the vulnerable. Above all, he helped hold the community together. It may seem like a modest responsibility. In reality, it was laying the foundations of an institution that would endure for centuries. Most people never notice foundations while they are being built. They only admire the building after it stands complete. The same was true here. The structure that would eventually become the church did not appear overnight. It emerged gradually, community by community, bishop by bishop, generation after generation. Among all these growing Christian centers, several cities began to acquire particular importance. Jerusalem remained sacred because it was where everything had begun. Antioch became one of the movement's great missionary centers. Alexandria developed into a remarkable place of learning and theological reflection. And then there was Rome. Not because it was yet the center of Christianity. It was not. but because another chapter in Simon's story was quietly unfolding there. According to a very ancient Christian tradition, one that most historians broadly accept regarding its central claim, while continuing to debate some of the details, Peter eventually traveled to Rome during the final years of his life. There, in the capital of the empire itself, the fisherman from Galilee would face the same fate as countless other believers. He would die. But his death would accomplish something no one could possibly have imagined. It would bind his memory forever to the city that would one day become the heart of the Vatican. According to one of the oldest Christian traditions, Peter was executed in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero. The earliest Christian writers place his martyrdom in the imperial capital. While no contemporary eyewitness account survives to describe his final moments in detail, there is broad historical agreement that Peter spent the last part of his life in Rome and most likely died there during Nero's persecution following the Great Fire. No one at the time could have guessed what that would mean. His death was not simply the end of one man's life. It became the beginning of a place of memory. For the first generations of Christians, the location where one of Jesus' closest disciples had been buried gradually took on profound significance. Not because anyone envisioned building a magnificent basilica there. Not because anyone imagined a sovereign city ruled by a pope. Simply because Peter rested there. People began visiting the site. Quietly. Without ceremony. Without marble monuments or towering churches. Imagine standing on that hillside during those early years. There are no grand processions. No crowds filling an enormous square. No choir echoing beneath a vast dome. Only a few believers making their way to a modest burial place, pausing in silence to remember a man they believed had walked beside Jesus himself. It is difficult to imagine a simpler beginning. And yet history often grows from places exactly like this. Memory needs somewhere to live. Communities need places where stories can be shared from one generation to the next. Little by little, Peter's grave became one of those places. The remarkable thing is that this happened naturally. No emperor ordered it. No government organized it. No architect designed it. The importance of the place emerged because people continued returning to it. Year after year. Generation after generation. The city of Rome slowly acquired something no other Christian community possessed in quite the same way. It was not simply another congregation among many. It was the city associated with the final years, and, according to ancient tradition, the burial of Peter himself. That connection would prove extraordinarily influential. Not immediately. Nothing in this story happens immediately. The church was still small. Christians remained a minority throughout the empire. Periods of relative peace alternated with new outbreaks of persecution depending on the policies of individual emperors and provincial governors. There was no uninterrupted march toward success. Only perseverance. Through all those decades, however, the Christian community in Rome continued to grow. Not necessarily faster than every other city, but steadily. The capital attracted people from every province. Merchants arrived with cargo from Egypt. Officials came from Spain. Soldiers marched in from the Rhine frontier. Travelers reached Rome from places separated by thousands of miles. Among them were Christians. Some stayed permanently. Others carried news back home. Letters passed through the city. Visitors exchanged ideas. The church in Rome gradually became a meeting point for communities scattered across the empire. It is important not to exaggerate this process. The Bishop of Rome was not yet the Pope in the medieval or modern sense. Christianity still consisted of many important centers, each led by its own bishop. Jerusalem remained deeply revered. Antioch continued to play a vital role. Alexandria was becoming one of Christianity's great intellectual capitals. The church was not yet organized around a single dominant authority, but Rome possessed something unique. It possessed Peter's memory. That memory quietly shaped the way other Christians viewed the Roman Church. When difficult questions arose, believers in distant cities increasingly looked toward Rome with respect. Sometimes they sought advice. Sometimes mediation. Sometimes simply reassurance that they remained connected to the wider Christian world. Prestige grows slowly. Unlike political power, it cannot be conquered overnight. It is earned through generations. And generation after generation, the church in Rome accumulated that prestige almost without noticing. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of every Christian gathering, the Roman Empire itself was beginning to change. For nearly 3 centuries, Rome had remained the unquestioned center of imperial power. Soon, however, the empire would enter one of the greatest periods of instability in its history. Ironically, it would be Rome's growing weakness, not its strength, that opened the next chapter in the story. Because as emperors struggled to hold the empire together, the church continued quietly holding its communities together. For almost 3 centuries, the Roman Empire had appeared unshakable. Its armies guarded frontiers stretching from Britain to the deserts of Syria. Its roads connected thousands of cities. Its laws governed millions of people. To most of its inhabitants, Rome did not simply seem powerful. It seemed permanent. Yet history has a quiet way of reminding us that no empire remains unchanged forever. During the 3rd century, cracks began to appear. At first they were easy to overlook. One emperor died, another took his place. Then another. And another still. Some ruled for years. Others survived only months before being overthrown or assassinated. Civil wars erupted with alarming frequency. Generals competed for the throne. Frontiers came under increasing pressure as different peoples tested Rome's ability to defend its borders. Economic problems made everything worse. Coins lost value. Trade became less reliable in many regions. Maintaining enormous armies grew increasingly expensive. Ordinary people felt the consequences long before historians gave the period a name. For a merchant, it meant uncertainty. For a farmer, higher taxes. For a traveler, roads that no longer felt as safe as they once had. The empire still stood. But confidence in its future had begun to fade. While Rome struggled with political instability, the Christian communities continued doing something remarkably simple. They kept meeting. They kept caring for one another. They kept preserving relationships that reached across cities and provinces. The contrast is striking. One of the largest political systems the world had ever seen was becoming increasingly fragile. A movement that had begun with a handful of fishermen was becoming steadily more resilient. Not because it possessed greater military strength. It possessed none. But because its foundations rested on something different. Communities. Shared beliefs. Mutual responsibility. If a family fell into poverty, other believers often helped them. If a traveler arrived from another city carrying a letter of introduction, he could expect hospitality from Christians he had never met before. If famine or hardship struck one community, others sometimes gathered support. These acts rarely appeared in the official records of the empire. To governors and emperors, they were almost invisible. To ordinary people, they could mean everything. This growing network gave Christianity a remarkable ability to endure uncertainty. When governments became unstable, relationships remained. When political leaders changed, local bishops remained. When armies marched elsewhere, Christian communities continued gathering week after week. Without intending to, the church was becoming one of the most stable institutions in an increasingly unstable world. No one planned it. It simply happened. History often unfolds that way. Large transformations are frequently the unintended result of countless ordinary decisions repeated over many years. Still, Christianity remained illegal for much of this period. Periods of tolerance alternated with renewed persecution. Some emperors largely ignored the church. Others viewed it as a threat to imperial unity. The most severe persecution came under Emperor Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century. Determined to restore traditional Roman religion and strengthen imperial authority, Diocletian issued a series of edicts aimed at dismantling the Christian movement. Church buildings were destroyed. Sacred texts were confiscated and burned. Clergy were arrested. Many believers were imprisoned or executed. From the imperial perspective, this appeared to be the final effort needed to eliminate Christianity once and for all. The movement had survived before. Surely it could not survive this. Yet once again, the prediction proved wrong. When the persecutions finally ended, Christianity was still there. Bruised. Smaller in some places. Traumatized by years of suffering. But alive. And perhaps stronger than ever in its sense of shared identity. Then history took one of its most unexpected turns. The next great change would not come from a bishop. Or a missionary. Or a martyr. It would come from an emperor. A man raised in the traditions of pagan Rome. A soldier. A political leader. Someone who had every reason to ignore Christianity. His name was Constantine. And with him, The story that had begun beside a quiet lake in Galilee was about to enter an entirely new chapter. Constantine was an unlikely figure to change the future of Christianity. He was born into a world where the old Roman gods still dominated public life. Temples stood in every major city. Imperial ceremonies honored Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, and countless other deities believed to protect the empire. Christianity, though growing, remained a minority faith. A significant one. But still a minority. No one looking at the political landscape of the early 4th century would have predicted that the future of the Church would soon become deeply connected to the future of the Roman Empire itself. Constantine certainly did not begin his career as a Christian emperor. He grew up in the world of Roman politics. A world of military campaigns, political alliances, family rivalries, and constant competition for power. The empire itself had recently undergone major reforms under Emperor Diocletian. Recognizing that one man could no longer govern such an enormous territory effectively, Diocletian divided imperial authority among several rulers in what became known as the Tetrarchy. On paper, the system promised stability. In practice, it created new rivalries. Every succession became uncertain. Every ambitious general became a potential claimant to the throne. Every political alliance carried the possibility of betrayal. Constantine learned quickly that survival depended as much upon judgment as courage. 4 years he fought to secure his position, moving through a world where today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy. Eventually, one rival stood above all the others: Maxentius. Their conflict would determine who controlled the western half of the Roman Empire. The decisive confrontation came in AD 312, near a bridge crossing the Tiber River just outside Rome. Today it is known as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. On the evening before the battle, according to ancient Christian sources, something happened that would become one of the most discussed moments in Christian history. Exactly what occurred remains difficult to determine. The earliest surviving accounts are not identical. Lactantius, writing only a few years later, says Constantine experienced a dream instructing him to place a Christian symbol upon his soldiers' shields. Several decades afterward, Eusebius of Caesarea recorded a different tradition. According to his account, Constantine saw a sign in the sky accompanied by words often translated as, "In this sign, conquer." Historians continue debating how these accounts should be understood. Were they literal experiences? Religious interpretations that developed afterward? Political symbolism? The evidence does not allow complete certainty. What can be said with confidence is something even more important. After the battle, Constantine himself associated his victory with the God of the Christians. That historical fact changed everything. Against considerable odds, Constantine defeated Maxentius. He entered Rome as the undisputed victor. For Christians across the empire, the implications were almost impossible to imagine. The most powerful man in the Western Roman world no longer regarded them as enemies. Instead, he began treating Christianity as a legitimate part of imperial life. The transformation did not happen overnight. Constantine did not suddenly abolish every traditional Roman practice. Nor did the empire instantly become Christian. History moves more patiently than that. But the direction had changed. The following year, in AD 313, Constantine and his eastern colleague Licinius reached an agreement that would permanently alter the legal status of Christianity. It became known as the Edict of Milan. Strictly speaking, it was not a declaration making Christianity the official religion of the empire. That would come decades later under another emperor. Instead, it did something equally revolutionary. It granted religious toleration. Christians were free to worship openly. Confiscated property was restored. Churches could exist legally. The generations who had hidden in private homes, uncertain whether each gathering might be their last, suddenly found themselves able to worship without fear of arrest. Imagine what that must have felt like. An elderly believer who had lived through Diocletian's persecutions could now walk openly into a Christian gathering without wondering whether soldiers would burst through the door. Children who had grown up hearing whispered prayers could now hear them spoken aloud. Communities that had survived in the shadows stepped into the light. Nothing about their beliefs had changed. Everything about their circumstances had. For the first time, Christianity could begin organizing itself in ways that persecution had never allowed. And that simple legal change would become one of the greatest turning points in the entire journey from Galilee to the Vatican. For nearly 3 centuries, Christians had learned how to survive in the shadows. Now they faced an entirely different challenge. How do you remain the same community once the danger disappears? Persecution had forced Christians to depend upon one another. Every gathering carried risk. Every new believer represented an act of courage. Unity had often been strengthened by necessity. Freedom, however, brings different kinds of challenges. When people are no longer struggling simply to survive, they begin asking deeper questions. Questions about leadership, about belief, about organization, about the future. Those questions had always existed. Now they could no longer be postponed. Churches that had once gathered quietly inside private homes could finally own property. Congregations became larger. Christian leaders could travel openly between cities. Bishops who had previously communicated through carefully carried letters were now able to meet face to face. For the first time, the Church possessed the freedom to think not merely about surviving the present, but about shaping the future. Constantine recognized something important. Whether or not his support for Christianity was motivated entirely by personal conviction has long been debated by historians. Political considerations almost certainly played a role as well. A stable empire benefited from stable institutions, and the Church had already demonstrated an extraordinary ability to organize communities across enormous distances. To Constantine, that organization represented an opportunity. The empire had spent decades tearing itself apart through civil wars. Its people spoke different languages. Its provinces followed different customs. Political unity had become increasingly fragile. Christianity offered something unusual. A network that already connected cities scattered across the Mediterranean. Not through military force, but through shared belief. That did not mean every Christian agreed about everything. Far from it. As the Church expanded, disagreements became increasingly visible. Some concerned practical matters. Others reached the very heart of Christian belief. One disagreement, in particular, spread with astonishing speed. It began in Alexandria, one of the greatest cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. There, a priest named Arius argued that the Son had been created by the Father and therefore was not eternal in exactly the same way as God the Father. Other bishops strongly rejected that teaching. Letters crossed the empire. Arguments intensified. Congregations became divided. What had begun as a theological dispute inside one city soon threatened the unity of churches hundreds of miles away. To modern readers, the debate can seem highly abstract. To the Christians living through it, it touched the very center of their faith. And to Constantine, it threatened something equally important: stability. An empire that had only recently emerged from years of civil conflict could hardly afford another source of division. So Constantine did something almost unimaginable. He invited bishops from across the Christian world to gather together and seek a common resolution. The meeting took place in AD 325 in the city of Nicaea. Imagine arriving there. Some bishops had traveled for weeks, others for months. Many bore visible reminders of the persecutions that had ended only a few years earlier. One man carried scars from imprisonment. Another had lost the use of an eye. Others had spent years hiding from imperial authorities. Now those same men entered a gathering convened by the emperor himself. The contrast was extraordinary. Only a generation earlier, Rome had attempted to destroy the Church. Now the emperor was providing the opportunity for its leaders to meet openly. The discussions were long, careful, sometimes deeply passionate. The bishops examined scripture. They debated language with remarkable precision. They sought expressions capable of protecting what they believed had been handed down from the apostles. Eventually, the council reached its conclusion. The majority affirmed that the Son was fully divine and of the same essence as the Father, rejecting Arius' teaching. The statement they produced became the foundation of what we now know as the Nicene Creed. Its exact wording would later be refined and expanded, but its importance can hardly be overstated. Yet for our story, another consequence may be even more significant. Nicaea demonstrated that Christianity had become something far larger than a collection of isolated local communities. Bishops from across the empire could gather, discuss, disagree, decide together. The Church was beginning to think of itself as universal, not merely scattered, but united. That quiet transformation would prove just as important as any emperor's decree, because institutions are not built only through victories. They are built through habits, through meetings, through shared decisions, through the slow development of structures capable of lasting for generations. And among all those growing Christian communities, one city continued to occupy a place unlike any other: Rome. Not because it was the largest Christian center, not because it possessed the greatest theologians, but because every road in this story still seemed to lead back to the memory of one fisherman named Peter. Rome's importance did not emerge from a decree. It emerged from memory. Long before bishops in Rome possessed widespread influence, the city already carried a powerful association with Peter and, according to equally ancient tradition, with Paul as well. The two men had lived very different lives. Peter had been a fisherman from Galilee. Paul had been an educated Roman citizen whose missionary journeys carried him across much of the eastern Mediterranean. One represented the intimate circle that had walked beside Jesus. The other represented the extraordinary expansion of the Christian message beyond Judea. According to the traditions preserved by the early church, both eventually met their deaths in Rome. Whether believers traveled there from Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, or Greece, they encountered a city that held the memory of both apostles. That memory quietly shaped expectations. When questions arose that affected the wider church, many naturally listened with particular attention to the community that guarded those memories. This did not mean every bishop agreed with Rome. Far from it. The churches of Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and later Constantinople all possessed enormous influence. Their bishops defended their own traditions with conviction. Christian leadership remained shared across many important centers. Yet the Bishop of Rome gradually occupied a distinctive position. Not because he commanded the others, but because his church was increasingly seen as preserving a unique apostolic inheritance. That distinction would become more significant with every passing generation. Meanwhile, Constantine's own ambitions extended beyond religious policy. He envisioned an empire renewed. An empire that would leave behind decades of civil war and present itself once again as strong, prosperous, and united. Rome, however, no longer seemed the ideal capital. Its political traditions were ancient. Its aristocracy was deeply rooted. Its location made governing the eastern provinces increasingly difficult. Constantine looked elsewhere, to an ancient Greek city called Byzantium. Situated on the narrow waters connecting Europe and Asia, it occupied one of the most remarkable strategic locations in the ancient world. Ships traveling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean passed nearby. Trade flowed through its harbors. Armies could move efficiently toward either continent. The location offered possibilities that old Rome no longer could. Constantine transformed the city on a breathtaking scale. Palaces rose. Forums expanded. Churches appeared beside public buildings. New walls enclosed growing neighborhoods. In AD 330, the city was formally dedicated as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Many contemporaries began calling it the New Rome. The title was more than symbolic. Constantinople became the principal residence of the emperor. Its political importance grew rapidly. Officials relocated. Administrators followed. Resources poured eastward. To many observers, it seemed obvious where the future of imperial government now lay. If someone had stood in Rome at that moment, they might have feared the city's greatest days were ending. In political terms, they would have been correct. The emperor no longer governed from the old capital with the same regularity. Attention increasingly shifted toward the eastern Mediterranean. Yet history delights in unexpected reversals. As imperial power slowly moved east, something else remained behind. The memory of Peter. The growing authority of the Roman bishop. The tombs visited by generations of believers. Rome was gradually losing political centrality while quietly gaining spiritual significance. The two developments happened almost simultaneously. Few people recognized the irony. Power and influence are not always the same thing. Political power often moves quickly. It follows armies, wealth, and governments. Spiritual influence moves much more slowly. It accumulates through trust, through tradition, through continuity. Constantinople possessed the emperor. Rome possessed memory. For centuries, both realities would shape the Christian world. The relationship between these two great cities would become one of cooperation, admiration, competition, and eventually profound disagreement. But that lay far in the future. For now, The Church continued expanding across an empire that still officially existed as one immense state, even as its center of gravity drifted steadily eastward. No one yet realized that the western half of that empire was approaching one of the greatest collapses in history. When it came, it would transform the Bishop of Rome from a respected church leader into something no previous generation could have imagined. Not merely a spiritual guide, but one of the few stable authorities left standing in a world that seemed to be falling apart. The Roman Empire did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. There was no solitary day when every citizen awoke to discover that Rome had fallen. Instead, the decline unfolded gradually, almost quietly. One province slipped beyond imperial control. Another frontier became impossible to defend. A military defeat here. An economic crisis there. Each event, taken alone, seemed survivable. Together, they reshaped the Western world. During the 4th and 5th centuries, new peoples entered imperial territory in ever greater numbers. Some arrived seeking land. Others fled from dangers farther east. Many hoped simply to build new lives within Rome's borders. The empire sometimes welcomed them as allies. Sometimes resisted them as enemies. Often it did both at once. The situation was rarely as simple as ancient historians, or modern films, sometimes suggest. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians, and many other groups were not united under a single purpose. Each possessed its own leaders, its own ambitions, its own relationship with Rome. Some served in the imperial army. Others fought against it. Many did both during different periods. The boundaries between Roman and barbarian were becoming increasingly blurred. A Roman general might command soldiers born far beyond the old frontiers. A Gothic leader might have spent years serving under Roman officers. The world was changing faster than old definitions could keep pace. For ordinary people, these political transformations were deeply personal. Imagine tending a vineyard in northern Italy. For decades, taxes had been collected by imperial officials. The roads had been maintained by Roman engineers. Disputes had been settled according to Roman law. Then, almost without warning, different authorities appeared. New rulers, new commanders, sometimes new languages. Life continued. The harvest still needed gathering. Children still needed feeding. But certainty became increasingly rare. In times like these, people naturally searched for institutions that remained familiar. The church was one of them. The bishop who had baptized your children remained the same even if the local governor changed. The congregation that gathered each week continued meeting even when armies marched nearby. The rhythms of worship offered stability in a world where political stability was becoming harder to find. This quiet consistency mattered enormously. The Bishop of Rome found himself serving not only as a religious leader but increasingly as someone whom ordinary citizens trusted during moments of uncertainty. His influence did not grow because emperors granted him sweeping new powers. Quite often, it grew because others were no longer able to fulfill responsibilities they once carried. When civil administration weakened, bishops often helped organize relief for the poor. When famine threatened, churches distributed food where they could. When refugees arrived, Christian communities frequently offered shelter. These were practical acts, not grand political statements. Yet practical acts have a remarkable way of creating lasting authority. People remember those who remain present during difficult times. One event captured the changing balance of the age with startling clarity. In AD 410, the Visigothic king Alaric entered Rome. For nearly 800 years, the city itself had been spared the humiliation of conquest by a foreign army. Its legions had carried war across continents. Its citizens had grown accustomed to believing their capital stood beyond the reach of enemies. Now that illusion shattered. For 3 days, Rome was sacked. The destruction was not the total annihilation later imaginations sometimes pictured. Many buildings survived. Much of the population remained. Yet the psychological impact was immense. If Rome itself could be entered by an enemy, what, then, remained secure? Across the Mediterranean, people struggled to comprehend the news. Some pagans argued that abandoning the traditional gods had weakened the empire. Others blamed political failures. Christians wrestled with the same questions. One bishop in North Africa, Augustine of Hippo, would respond by writing one of the most influential works in Christian history, The City of God, reminding believers that no earthly empire, however magnificent, could ever be eternal. His words reflected a profound shift. For centuries, Rome had seemed almost immortal. Now its mortality was impossible to deny. Yet while confidence in the empire declined, confidence in the church continued to grow. The old political order was beginning to tremble. The spiritual community that had once hidden inside private homes was steadily becoming one of the strongest threads holding society together. The irony would have astonished Peter. The fisherman who had once feared speaking openly in Jerusalem could never have imagined that centuries later, the community built upon his witness would endure while the empire that executed him slowly crumbled around it. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire still possessed emperors. What it increasingly lacked was authority. Titles remained. Ceremonies continued. Official decrees were still issued. But the ability to enforce those decisions across the vast territories of the West had steadily diminished. Real power often rested elsewhere. Powerful generals commanded armies that owed them personal loyalty. Regional rulers exercised increasing independence. Local communities learned to solve their own problems rather than waiting for distant officials. In that changing world, the Bishop of Rome occupied a unique position. He was not elected by soldiers. He inherited no imperial throne. His authority depended upon something much less visible: continuity. Generation after generation, the bishops of Rome had remained in place while emperors rose and fell with astonishing speed. People noticed. Stability has its own quiet influence. One bishop, in particular, would come to symbolize this new reality. His name was Leo. History remembers him as Leo the Great. He became Bishop of Rome in AD 440, at a time when both the Church and the Empire faced enormous uncertainty. Leo possessed remarkable gifts. He was a gifted preacher, a careful theologian, an able administrator. But perhaps his greatest strength lay elsewhere. He understood that leadership often meant preserving confidence when others were losing hope. He wrote extensively to bishops throughout the Christian world, encouraging unity and defending what he believed to be the apostolic faith. His letters reveal a man deeply conscious of Rome's unique place within the Church. Again and again, he pointed not to his own abilities, but to Peter. For Leo, the authority of the Roman bishop rested upon continuity with the apostle whose memory the city guarded. This idea did not instantly persuade everyone. Many bishops respected Rome while continuing to defend the independence of their own churches. The relationship between the great Christian centers remained complex. Yet Leo expressed the Roman understanding with unusual clarity. His words would influence debates for centuries to come. Then history presented him with a challenge no bishop had ever expected. In AD 452, a vast force led by Attila advanced into northern Italy. Even in his own lifetime, Attila's reputation inspired fear. Roman writers described entire regions emptied by his campaigns. Stories about him spread rapidly, mixing fact with legend until it became difficult to separate one from the other. People called him the Scourge of God. Whether they believed the title literally or not, they understood its meaning. His arrival represented catastrophe. As Attila moved southward, panic spread. Cities wondered whether they would be spared. Families gathered what possessions they could carry. Refugees crowded the roads. The imperial government struggled to respond. It was in this atmosphere that Leo undertook one of the most famous journeys in the history of the papacy. He traveled north to meet Attila. Imagine the uncertainty surrounding that journey. No one could guarantee the outcome. There were no assurances of safety. No certainty that the meeting would even take place. Only the hope that conversation might succeed where armies could not. Exactly what happened when Leo met Attila remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Ancient sources agree that the meeting occurred. They also agree that Attila eventually withdrew from Italy. Why? The answer is less certain. Some later Christian traditions emphasized Leo's personal courage and even described miraculous visions accompanying the encounter. Modern historians also point to practical factors. Attila's army faced shortages of supplies. Disease threatened his forces. The Eastern Roman Empire had begun applying military pressure elsewhere. Withdrawal may have reflected several considerations rather than a single cause. History often resists simple explanations. Still, one fact remains undeniable. The Bishop of Rome had become an important diplomatic figure. When imperial power seemed uncertain, it was Leo who represented the city. Not merely as a church leader, but as someone capable of speaking on behalf of its people. The symbolism mattered as much as the outcome. Only a few centuries earlier, Christians had hidden from Roman officials. Now the Bishop of Rome stood before one of the most feared rulers in Europe, negotiating while imperial authority faltered around him. It was another quiet reversal. Not achieved through conquest. Not secured by armies. But earned through centuries of patient continuity. The transformation from persecuted community to enduring institution was becoming impossible to ignore. And still, an even greater turning point lay just ahead. Within a single generation, the Western Roman Empire itself would disappear. The Bishop of Rome, however, would remain. In AD 476, a young man named Romulus Augustulus was removed from the imperial throne. The event is often described as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It makes for a memorable date. Easy to remember. Easy to place in history books. Reality, as it so often does, was quieter. There was no great final battle that brought an empire to an abrupt end. No single proclamation announcing that Rome had ceased to exist. Life continued the following morning. Markets opened. Farmers worked their fields. Children played in narrow streets. Bishops celebrated the liturgy. The difference was that there would be no new Western emperor. Odoacer, the Germanic leader who had taken power in Italy, chose not to appoint another. Instead, he acknowledged the authority of the emperor in Constantinople while ruling Italy himself. The old imperial structure in the West simply faded away. Governments disappear more quietly than legends often suggest. For the people living through those years, the question was rarely whether an empire had officially ended. The question was much simpler. Who could still keep order? Who could settle disputes? Who could organize aid when famine threatened? Who could speak for the city when danger approached? Increasingly, one answer emerged. The bishop. Nowhere was that more evident than in Rome. The ancient capital still possessed magnificent monuments. Its aqueducts, though damaged in places, continued carrying water. Its forums still stood. Its temples still overlooked familiar streets. But many of the institutions that had once governed the city no longer possessed the strength they once had. The bishop's household became something more than an ecclesiastical office. It became an administrative center. A place where charity was organized. Where correspondence arrived from distant kingdoms. Where negotiations could be conducted. Where ordinary people sought assistance. No one had planned for this. No ancient Christian text had predicted that bishops would one day assume responsibilities once carried by imperial officials. History had simply created a vacuum. The church stepped into it because someone had to. This gradual transformation explains one of the greatest misunderstandings about the papacy. Many imagine that the Pope suddenly became powerful. That is not what happened. His influence accumulated over centuries. Each crisis added another responsibility. Each responsibility strengthened the institution. Not through conquest, but through necessity. Imagine living in Rome during those uncertain decades. You need help feeding your family after a poor harvest. You need someone to negotiate the release of prisoners. You need aid after flooding damages part of the city. The emperor lives far away. Military commanders come and go. Political leaders change with bewildering speed. The bishop remains. Familiarity creates trust. Trust creates influence. Influence, exercised patiently over generations, becomes authority. This was not authority in the modern political sense. The Bishop of Rome still possessed no vast kingdom. No permanent army. No royal treasury. Yet he held something surprisingly durable. Moral credibility. That kind of authority cannot be minted like coins. It cannot be inherited automatically. It must be earned repeatedly. The centuries of persecution had given the church a reputation for endurance. The centuries of service during the empire's decline gave it a reputation for reliability. Those two qualities together proved extraordinarily powerful. Meanwhile, the Christian world itself continued evolving. The eastern half of the old Roman Empire remained prosperous. Constantinople flourished. Its emperors still governed an immense realm. Its churches grew increasingly magnificent. Its theologians continued debating profound questions about faith, scripture, and the nature of Christ. The Bishop of Rome was influential. But he was not alone. The bishops of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem all guided ancient Christian communities with traditions reaching back centuries. The relationship among these great centers required constant patience. Sometimes they agreed. Sometimes they disagreed strongly. Letters crossed the Mediterranean carrying theological arguments, requests for advice, and appeals for support. The Church remained united. But maintaining that unity required continuous effort. Distance alone complicated everything. Travel from Rome to Constantinople demanded weeks. Storms delayed ships. Roads became dangerous. Misunderstandings lingered because clarification could take months. And yet the conversation never stopped. Across mountains, seas, and languages, Christians continued trying to preserve the sense that they belonged to one universal church. At the western end of that world, however, the Bishop of Rome was beginning to occupy a position unlike any his predecessors could have imagined. The fisherman who had once mended nets beside the Sea of Galilee had left no palace, no throne, no written constitution, only a memory. Yet that memory had quietly survived emperors, persecutions, invasions, and the collapse of an empire. Soon, it would begin shaping not only the future of the Church, but the future of Europe itself. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not erase Roman civilization. It transformed it. Across the former imperial provinces, new kingdoms slowly emerged. The Ostrogoths ruled in Italy. The Visigoths established themselves in Spain. The Franks expanded across Gaul. The old imperial map dissolved into a patchwork of different rulers, languages, customs, and ambitions. At first glance, it might have seemed as though Europe had fractured beyond repair. Yet beneath these political changes, another network continued to bind distant regions together. The Church. A bishop in southern Gaul could still exchange letters with Rome. Monasteries copied the same sacred texts in Italy and Spain. Pilgrims continued traveling to holy places despite the dangers of the roads. Kings came and went. The Christian calendar remained. The seasons of worship remained. The memory of the apostles remained. For many ordinary people, these familiar rhythms provided a sense of continuity that politics no longer could. One institution became especially important during these uncertain centuries: the monastery. Long before monasteries filled the landscapes of medieval Europe, men and women had begun withdrawing into lives of prayer, simplicity, and disciplined work. Some sought solitude in the deserts of Egypt. Others formed small communities devoted to shared prayer. Their purpose was not to preserve civilization. They simply wished to devote themselves more completely to God. History, however, often assigns people roles they never intended to play. As monasteries spread westward, they became places where books were copied by hand. Libraries slowly formed. Knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared found careful guardians. Imagine entering one of these early monasteries. The world outside may be uncertain. Armies may march across distant valleys. Kings may struggle for power. Inside, a monk bends quietly over a wooden desk. A single candle flickers. Hour after hour, he copies words onto parchment with astonishing patience. Every letter matters. Every line demands concentration. He cannot know whether anyone centuries later will ever read the page before him. He copies it anyway. Without realizing it, thousands of such men preserved not only Christian writings but also many works of classical literature, ancient philosophy, Roman history, poetry, grammar. Texts that might easily have vanished survived because someone believed they were worth copying. It was slow work. Painfully slow. A single manuscript could require months. Sometimes longer. There were no printing presses. Every copy passed through human hands. Every page reflected hours of quiet attention. These monks rarely imagined themselves changing history. Most probably believed they were simply fulfilling their daily responsibilities. Yet civilization is often preserved not by dramatic heroes, but by patient people repeating ordinary tasks with extraordinary care. The Bishop of Rome increasingly encouraged and supported this expanding Christian world. His influence spread less through political commands than through correspondence, teaching, and relationships. Missionaries carried Christianity into regions that had once stood beyond Rome's frontiers. Ireland, parts of Britain, Germanic territories farther north. The faith crossed borders that Roman legions had never permanently secured. It is one of history's gentlest ironies. The empire had attempted to expand through military conquest. The church often expanded through persuasion, education, and service. The process was neither quick nor always peaceful. Conversion unfolded over generations. Old customs blended with new beliefs. Ancient traditions lingered beside Christian practices. History seldom changes in neat, uncomplicated lines. It changes through countless small adjustments made by ordinary people living ordinary lives. Throughout all these transformations, Rome retained a unique attraction. Pilgrims continued arriving. Some came seeking forgiveness. Others came to pray at the tombs of Peter and Paul. Many simply wished to stand where memory connected the present with the earliest days of Christianity. The city itself had changed enormously. Many ancient buildings had fallen into ruin. Grass grew between broken stones. Some forums echoed with silence where crowds had once gathered. Yet Peter's memory endured. The grandeur of imperial Rome had faded. The quiet significance of Christian Rome continued growing. The center of gravity had shifted almost imperceptibly. Not from one city to another, but from one kind of authority to another. The authority of emperors had shaped centuries. The authority associated with Peter's successor was beginning to shape the centuries still to come. The road from Galilee to the Vatican was proving far longer, and far more unexpected, than anyone standing beside that first fishing boat could ever have imagined. As the centuries passed, the Bishop of Rome gradually acquired a new way of describing his role. Not as a king, not as an emperor, but as the successor of Peter. That phrase carried enormous meaning. It suggested that leadership within the church was not beginning anew with each generation. Instead, it was being handed on, like a carefully tended flame, from one bishop to the next. This idea of apostolic succession became one of the strongest foundations of the Roman Church. The argument was simple. Jesus had entrusted Peter with a unique responsibility. Peter had ended his life in Rome. The bishops who followed him inherited not Peter's personality, nor his humble trade as a fisherman, but the office associated with his ministry. Not every Christian community understood that office in exactly the same way. The churches of the East respected Peter deeply while also emphasizing the shared authority of all the apostles and their successors. The conversation would continue for centuries. Yet in the West, the connection between Peter and the Bishop of Rome became increasingly central. It shaped how people understood unity. It shaped how disputes were resolved. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it shaped the office that would later be called the Papacy. Meanwhile, another remarkable figure appeared whose influence would reach far beyond his own lifetime. His name was Gregory. History remembers him as Gregory the Great. When Gregory became Bishop of Rome in AD 590, Italy faced enormous difficulties. Floods had damaged crops. Disease spread through crowded cities. The Lombards threatened large parts of the peninsula. Imperial officials in distant Constantinople possessed only limited ability to respond quickly. Gregory inherited challenges that would have overwhelmed many political rulers. Yet he approached them with remarkable practicality. He reorganized the administration of church lands to provide food for the poor. He supervised relief efforts during shortages. He negotiated with Lombard leaders when military solutions seemed impossible. He encouraged missionary work beyond Italy. To later generations, Gregory became an example of what the Bishop of Rome could be. Not merely a theologian, not merely a guardian of doctrine, but a servant responsible for the welfare of entire communities. One small detail reveals much about his character. Although later generations often described him with magnificent titles, Gregory himself preferred another expression. Servus servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. The phrase was striking. At a time when rulers delighted in displaying power, Gregory chose language emphasizing service. Whether every later pope lived fully according to that ideal is, of course, another question. History records saints and failures alike. Wise leaders, weak leaders, visionaries, politicians. The office remained constant even as the individuals occupying it differed enormously. That, too, is part of the story. Institutions survive precisely because they extend beyond any single person. The papacy was becoming one of Europe's oldest continuously functioning offices. Kings died. Dynasties disappeared. Kingdoms divided. The succession of bishops in Rome continued. One after another. Year after year. Century after century. Far beyond Italy, the Christian world kept expanding. Missionaries crossed the English Channel. Others traveled through forests that stretched across Central Europe. Monasteries appeared in valleys where Roman officials had never governed. Churches rose in places where Peter himself could never have imagined people gathering in Christ's name. The fisherman from Galilee had spoken to villagers along the shores of a small inland sea. Now his memory reached distant islands battered by Atlantic winds. Mountain villages beyond the Alps. River settlements deep within Europe. The geography of Christianity had become almost unimaginably vast. And wherever these communities looked toward Rome, they were looking not merely toward a city. They were looking toward a story. A story connecting fishermen, martyrs, bishops, emperors, monks, pilgrims, and ordinary believers across 6 remarkable centuries. The Vatican itself, however, was still only beginning to emerge. The place where Peter had been buried had long attracted pilgrims. Churches had been built and rebuilt nearby. Yet the small hill across the Tiber had not yet become the independent spiritual center recognized around the world today. That transformation would require another long chapter of history. One filled with magnificent basilicas, powerful medieval popes, artists whose work would astonish generations, and moments when the church itself would face some of its greatest triumphs and its deepest crises. By the beginning of the second millennium, the hill where Peter had once been buried had become one of the most important destinations in the Christian world. Pilgrims arrived from every direction. Some traveled for weeks. Others spent months crossing mountains, rivers, and forests. A few devoted years of their lives to the journey. Most would never meet the Bishop of Rome personally. That was not their purpose. They came because places carry memory. To kneel near the tomb believed to hold the remains of Peter was, for many, to feel connected with the very beginnings of the Christian story. Imagine joining those travelers. Your boots are worn from hundreds of miles on dusty roads. You have crossed narrow bridges, slept in monasteries, and followed routes used by countless pilgrims before you. At last, the skyline of Rome appears. Not the glittering imperial capital described by ancient poets. A different Rome. A medieval city where ruined temples stand beside churches, where fragments of marble from forgotten emperors have found new life in Christian buildings. The city has changed. Its memory has not. Above Peter's grave stood the great basilica commissioned centuries earlier by Emperor Constantine. Compared with the enormous church that exists today, it was very different. Its appearance belonged to the late Roman world rather than the Renaissance. Its walls had witnessed generations of worshippers. Its columns had echoed with prayers spoken in dozens of languages. Kings had entered its doors. Peasants had entered those same doors. The building welcomed both without distinction. Inside, lamps burned softly above the place associated with Peter's burial. Pilgrims approached with quiet reverence. Some prayed in silence. Others wept. Many simply stood still. For them, the journey itself had become part of the prayer. The basilica was not merely an impressive structure. It was a bridge across time. Each visitor carried home stories. Stories of Rome. Stories of Peter. Stories of the bishop who presided over the church from the city where the apostle had given his life. Those stories spread throughout Europe. They strengthened the idea that Rome remained the spiritual heart of Western Christianity. As the centuries unfolded, popes became increasingly involved in matters extending far beyond theology. Kings sought their approval. Princes requested their mediation. Disputes between rulers sometimes ended before the Bishop of Rome rather than on a battlefield. This growing influence brought opportunities. It also brought dangers. Spiritual leadership and political power rarely exist together without creating difficult tensions. The popes sincerely believed they were protecting the church. Secular rulers sincerely believed they were protecting their kingdoms. Their interests sometimes aligned. Just as often, they collided. History would remember fierce disagreements over who possessed the authority to appoint bishops, who could crown an emperor, who ultimately held the higher responsibility before God. These conflicts were rarely simple contests between good and evil. They reflected competing ideas about how Christian society itself should be ordered. For ordinary believers, however, daily faith looked much the same as it always had. Families gathered for worship. Children learned familiar prayers. Monks copied manuscripts. Farmers paused their labor for feast days marked by church bells. The great debates unfolding between kings and popes often felt very distant from village life. Yet the institutions shaped by those debates quietly influenced everyone. Cathedrals rose above growing towns. Schools developed beside monasteries and churches. Hospitals cared for the sick under Christian foundations. The church was becoming woven into nearly every aspect of medieval society. All of it could be traced, in one way or another, back to a chain of events no one could have predicted. A fisherman answering an unexpected invitation. A small gathering in Jerusalem. Letters carried across Roman roads. Martyrs whose names survived long after emperors had been forgotten. The collapse of an empire. The patient work of bishops, monks, and ordinary believers. History often appears inevitable when viewed from a distance. Standing at the end of 1,000 years, it can seem obvious that the Vatican would emerge as one of the world's great spiritual centers. But nothing about this journey was inevitable. At every stage, different outcomes remained possible. That uncertainty is what makes the story so deeply human. It reminds you that civilizations are not built by destiny alone. They are built by countless choices made by people who never know how history will remember them. The Vatican that millions recognize today did not appear all at once. It was built. Stone by stone. Generation by generation. Each age left its own mark upon the hill where Peter had been buried. Some contributed prayer. Others contributed scholarship. Others wealth. Others extraordinary works of art. By the late Middle Ages, however, Constantine's ancient basilica was showing its age. For more than 1,000 years it had welcomed pilgrims from across Christendom. Its walls had endured earthquakes, weather, and the steady passage of time. Repairs became increasingly frequent. Parts of the structure weakened. The church that had once symbolized permanence was itself becoming fragile. The decision to replace it was not made lightly. To rebuild the resting place associated with Peter meant altering one of the most revered sites in the Christian world. Yet church leaders believed that future generations deserved a sanctuary worthy of its significance. The undertaking would become one of the greatest architectural projects in human history. Its construction would stretch across more than a century. Several of Europe's greatest architects contributed to its design. Plans changed repeatedly. Ideas evolved. Each generation inherited unfinished work from the one before. Among those who shaped the project was Donato Bramante, whose ambitious vision imagined an immense church unlike anything Europe had yet seen. After him came others. Raphael added his own ideas. Antonio da Sangallo proposed different solutions. Then, many years later, an aging Michelangelo accepted responsibility for guiding the work. Imagine Michelangelo climbing through the unfinished structure. By then he was already celebrated as a sculptor and painter. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel had secured his place among history's greatest artists. Yet architecture demanded a different kind of patience. Every decision affected not only beauty but stability. Columns had to support impossible weights. Walls had to endure centuries not yet lived. The magnificent dome that now defines the skyline of Rome owes much to Michelangelo's vision. He did not live to see it completed. Few builders of great cathedrals ever did. That is another quiet lesson history offers. Some of humanity's greatest achievements require people willing to devote themselves to work whose completion belongs to another generation. As the basilica slowly rose above Rome, pilgrims watched the transformation with wonder. Scaffolding surrounded unfinished walls. Stonecutters shaped marble that would outlast them. Cranes, powered by human and animal strength, lifted enormous blocks high into the air. The construction site itself became a symbol of faith joined with extraordinary craftsmanship. Yet this remarkable project also carried an unexpected cost. Building such a magnificent church required enormous financial resources. Across Europe, efforts to raise those funds sometimes relied upon practices that many believers found troubling. The preaching of indulgences, particularly where it became closely associated with fundraising, created growing unease. What had begun as a pastoral practice concerning repentance and the remission of temporal penalties was, in some places, presented in ways that sounded dangerously close to a financial transaction. Many sincere Christians worried that something essential was being lost. Among them was an Augustinian monk living hundreds of miles north of Rome. His name was Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther challenged several practices that he believed required reform. His famous 9-to-5 theses were intended to encourage academic and theological debate. Instead, they ignited one of the most profound transformations in Christian history. The movement that followed became known as the Protestant Reformation. It reshaped kingdoms, divided churches, inspired renewal in some places and bitter conflict in others. The Vatican suddenly found itself facing questions unlike any it had encountered before. Questions not only about authority, but about scripture, tradition, salvation, the role of the Pope himself. The Church responded through what historians now call the Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent met over many years to clarify doctrine, reform abuses, improve the education of clergy, and strengthen the spiritual life of the Church. The response was not simply defensive. It also became a period of remarkable renewal. New religious orders emerged. Missionaries carried Christianity across oceans to lands unknown to Peter, Paul, or Constantine. Schools multiplied. Hospitals expanded. Art flourished with renewed purpose. The Vatican had entered another chapter. No longer merely the heir to the Roman Empire's memory. It had become the center of a truly global church. The journey from a fisherman beside the Sea of Galilee had reached continents that the ancient Romans themselves had never imagined. And still, the story was far from over. The age of exploration carried Christianity into a world larger than anyone in medieval Europe had imagined. Ships departed from the ports of Portugal and Spain, crossing oceans that ancient geographers had scarcely understood. Alongside sailors and merchants traveled priests, monks, and missionaries. Some hoped to accompany new settlements. Others dreamed of reaching peoples who had never heard the Christian story. The Vatican suddenly found itself connected to lands separated by entire oceans. Letters that had once taken weeks to reach Rome now required many months. News arrived from the Americas, from Africa, from India, from China, from Japan. The church that had once struggled to communicate between Jerusalem and Rome was now attempting to care for communities scattered across nearly every known continent. Imagine the patience such communication demanded. A bishop in Mexico might write to Rome seeking guidance. By the time his letter arrived, seasons had changed. Months later, the reply began the same long journey back across the Atlantic. Important decisions unfolded at the speed of sailing ships. And yet the connection endured. Rome remained a point of reference for millions who would never see its streets. Not every encounter between Christianity and new cultures unfolded peacefully. History asks us to acknowledge that honestly. Missionaries often displayed extraordinary courage, learning unfamiliar languages and living among distant peoples for decades. Many sincerely defended indigenous communities from exploitation and violence. Others, however, became entangled with colonial systems that brought suffering as well as change. Faith, politics, commerce, and empire frequently traveled together. Untangling them is one of the historian's most difficult tasks. The story resists simple judgments. It contains compassion, sacrifice, misunderstanding, wisdom, pride, acts of remarkable generosity, and moments of profound injustice. Human history rarely offers only one of these. The Vatican itself often found its leaders balancing ideals with political realities that offered no perfect solutions. That tension became especially visible in the 17th century. Science was opening new windows onto the universe. Astronomers pointed telescopes toward the heavens. Mathematicians described nature with astonishing precision. Questions emerged that previous generations had never imagined asking. One name became forever associated with this encounter: Galileo Galilei. Galileo did not invent the idea that the Earth moves around the Sun. Earlier thinkers, especially Nicholas Copernicus, had already proposed it. What Galileo contributed was powerful observational evidence gathered through his telescope. He observed mountains on the Moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, the changing phases of Venus. The heavens proved far more dynamic than many scholars had believed. These discoveries sparked intense debate. Not only scientific debate, but theological debate as well. Some church authorities feared that new interpretations of the cosmos might undermine traditional readings of Scripture. Galileo argued that careful observation of nature and faithful interpretation of Scripture need not contradict one another. The disagreement eventually led to his famous trial. History has often reduced the episode to a simple conflict between science and religion. Reality was considerably more complicated. Personal rivalries, politics, questions of authority, and the scientific knowledge available at the time all played important roles. Even so, the affair left a lasting mark. Centuries later, the Catholic Church would publicly acknowledge mistakes made in its handling of Galileo's case. It became a reminder that institutions, however ancient, continue learning through history. The Vatican story, like the story of every human institution, includes moments of wisdom and moments of error. That balance is important. To tell only one side would not be history. It would be legend. Through every triumph and every failure, however, one remarkable continuity remained. Pilgrims continued arriving. The bells continued ringing. The successor of Peter continued receiving visitors from every corner of the world. Empires had risen and disappeared. Kingdoms had been born and forgotten. Languages had evolved beyond recognition. Yet the quiet hill where a fisherman was believed to have been buried remained one of humanity's enduring destinations. It is an extraordinary thought. A place once lying beyond the walls of Imperial Rome had become one of the best-known spiritual centers on earth. And yet, for all its global influence, the Vatican eventually faced a challenge unlike any before. Not an invading army. Not the collapse of an empire. But the arrival of the modern world. The 18th and 19th centuries transformed Europe with astonishing speed. Ideas about liberty, democracy, and national identity spread across the continent. Old monarchies weakened. New nations emerged. Industrial cities expanded. Railways connected places that had once seemed impossibly distant. The world was accelerating. 4 centuries, the popes had governed not only the church but also extensive territories in central Italy known as the Papal States. These lands provided independence. The pope was not merely a spiritual leader. He was also a temporal ruler, responsible for taxes, administration, diplomacy, and defense. It was a role inherited gradually over many centuries rather than designed from the beginning. As Italy moved toward national unification during the 19th century, that arrangement came under increasing pressure. Many Italians dreamed of a single united nation. They believed the peninsula should no longer remain divided among numerous kingdoms, duchies, and territories. The Papal States stood directly in the path of that vision. Political negotiations alternated with military campaigns. One by one, the territories governed by the Pope became part of the growing Kingdom of Italy. Finally, in 1870, Italian forces entered Rome. The Pope's temporal kingdom effectively came to an end. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the Bishop of Rome no longer ruled a broad stretch of Italian land. Many believed the papacy had suffered an irreversible defeat. Some wondered whether the institution itself could survive. History, however, had already taught a different lesson. The strength of the papacy had never rested entirely upon territory. It had survived persecution without property. It had survived the collapse of the Roman Empire without imperial protection. Perhaps it could survive this as well. For nearly 60 years, the relationship between the popes and the Italian state remained unresolved. The popes considered themselves, in a symbolic sense, prisoners within the Vatican. Italian governments insisted that Rome must remain the capital of the nation. The disagreement lingered across generations. Then, in 1929, an agreement known as the Lateran Treaty finally established a solution. The Vatican city-state came into existence. Its territory was astonishingly small. Less than half a square kilometer. Tiny compared with the kingdoms and empires that had once dominated Europe. Yet its significance extended far beyond its physical size. The arrangement guaranteed the Pope's independence from any national government while recognizing Vatican City as a sovereign state. It was a remarkable historical irony. After centuries of governing large territories, the papacy emerged with one of the smallest sovereign states on earth. And yet, in many respects, its international influence only continued to grow. Diplomats from countries around the world established relations with the Holy See. Pilgrims continued arriving in ever greater numbers. Radio, newspapers, photography, and eventually television allowed people thousands of miles away to hear the Pope's voice almost instantly. The distances that had once required months of travel began disappearing. Imagine Peter trying to understand such a world. A fisherman who had crossed the Sea of Galilee in a wooden boat could scarcely have imagined messages traveling across oceans in moments. The small gatherings inside borrowed homes had become a worldwide community connected by technologies beyond the imagination of the ancient world. The hill where he was believed to have been buried now welcomed millions of visitors every year. Some arrived seeking faith. Others sought history. Many came simply out of curiosity. All found themselves standing in a place where nearly 2,000 years of human experience seemed layered one upon another. Ancient Rome, early Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the modern age. Every century had left its traces. Every generation had added another chapter. The Vatican became something more than the headquarters of a religious institution. It became a living archive of civilization itself. Within its walls, priceless manuscripts rested beside modern offices. Renaissance masterpieces overlooked pilgrims carrying smartphones. Swiss guards wearing uniforms inspired by Renaissance traditions stood watch outside buildings equipped with modern security systems. The old and the new existed side by side. Not in competition, but in conversation. It was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of the long journey that had begun beside a quiet lake in Galilee. A journey that proved history is rarely shaped by those who appear strongest in their own lifetime. More often, it is shaped by those whose influence grows patiently, one generation at a time. The Vatican today is unlike any other place on earth. It is the smallest independent state in the world, yet it serves as the spiritual center for well over 1 billion Catholics spread across every inhabited continent. Its territory can be crossed on foot in only a few minutes. Its influence has traveled across nearly 2,000 years. That contrast captures the entire story. A tiny place carrying an immense history. If you were to walk through St. Peter's Square at dawn, before the crowds have fully gathered, you might notice something curious. The square itself seems designed to embrace. The great colonnades sweep outward like open arms, surrounding the space where pilgrims from every nation eventually gather. Some arrive speaking Spanish, others English, Italian, French, Swahili, Korean, Arabic, languages that did not even exist when Peter walked the roads of Galilee. Yet they all arrive at the same destination, not because of military conquest, not because of political obligation, but because of a story. Inside the Basilica, sunlight filters through enormous windows, touching marble that craftsmen shaped centuries ago. Far below the floor lies the area traditionally associated with Peter's tomb. Whether visitors come with deep religious conviction or simple historical curiosity, many pause there a little longer than expected. Perhaps it is because the place invites reflection. It reminds you that history often begins with remarkably ordinary people. A fisherman, a tax collector, a tent maker, women and men whose names might easily have disappeared into obscurity. Instead, their lives became connected to one of humanity's longest continuous stories. The Vatican is often associated with spectacular art. Michelangelo's dome, Bernini's sweeping colonnades, Raphael's frescoes, the Sistine Chapel, where generations of artists have looked upward in astonishment. These masterpieces deserve every bit of their reputation. Yet they are not the oldest treasures preserved there. The oldest treasure is memory. The memory of communities that gathered quietly when discovery could mean death. The memory of letters copied by candlelight. The memory of pilgrims who crossed mountains on foot simply to pray near Peter's resting place. The memory of bishops who inherited responsibilities they had never expected to carry. Buildings can be rebuilt. Paintings can be restored. Even entire cities can change beyond recognition. Memory is more fragile. It survives only when one generation chooses to pass it to the next. That is, perhaps, the deepest lesson of this journey. From Galilee to the Vatican, history was never carried forward by monuments alone. It was carried by people. By teachers patiently explaining ancient stories. By parents introducing children to familiar prayers. By monks preserving books. By architects raising impossible domes. By pilgrims continuing to arrive, century after century. By countless ordinary believers whose names history never recorded. When we look back across these 2,000 years, it is tempting to focus only on the famous figures. Peter, Paul, Constantine, Gregory, Michelangelo, the long line of popes. They matter deeply. But history is rarely made by famous people alone. For every name remembered, there are thousands forgotten. Stonecutters, scribes, farmers, widows, travelers, children who grew into adults and quietly passed their faith to another generation. Without them, none of this would exist. The Vatican, then, is not simply the story of a city, nor merely the story of the papacy. It is the story of continuity, of an institution that survived persecution, political upheaval, invasions, reform, revolution, scientific discovery, and the astonishing transformations of the modern world. Not because every decision was perfect. History records many mistakes alongside remarkable achievements. Not because every leader possessed equal wisdom. They did not. But because each generation inherited something older than itself and chose, in one way or another, to preserve it. As evening settles over Rome, the great dome of St. Peter's gradually fades into softer light. The crowds begin to thin. The footsteps grow quieter. The bells echo across the ancient city just as they have for centuries. Somewhere beneath that vast church rests the memory of a fisherman who almost certainly never imagined that his life would shape the course of civilizations. He could not have foreseen emperors embracing his faith. He could not have imagined artists covering chapel ceilings with masterpieces. He could not have pictured pilgrims arriving by airplane from countries unknown to the ancient world. He simply answered a call beside a quiet lake. Sometimes history begins exactly like that. Not with certainty. Not with power. But with one ordinary person taking a single step into an unknown future. And from that single step, taken on the shores of Galilee nearly 2,000 years ago, unfolded one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of human history. A journey that crossed empires and oceans, survived triumph and tragedy, and ultimately found its enduring home upon a small hill beside the Tiber. A place the world now knows as the Vatican. And perhaps that is the gentlest reminder history can offer before sleep finally arrives. The greatest stories are rarely those planned from the beginning. They are the ones that grow patiently, quietly, and unexpectedly, shaped by countless lives woven together across the centuries, until what once seemed impossible simply becomes part of the world itself. So, as the lights of Rome continue to glow beneath the evening sky, you can leave this story knowing that every towering cathedral, every ancient manuscript, every weathered stone, and every whispered prayer ultimately traces its path back to a handful of ordinary people who believed that even the smallest beginning could carry hope into the future. And with that quiet thought, the long journey from Galilee to the Vatican gently comes to its end.